Recently, the Westonka Historical Society hosted a celebration of the history of Island Park. The day began with an Ellen Elma's cruise around the island that included historical narration identifying points of interest. Into the evening, many local families shared their personal stories about living on Island Park. LMCC video producer Ken Bush documented the day's activities and highlights this walk down memory lane.
Hi, my name's Jeff Magnuson. I'm with the Westonka Historical Society, and I lived on the island for about 11 years. I'm one of the escapees, though I live over in Halstead's Bay now. Moved out. And I've been asked today to narrate this cruise and point out some of the historical sites around the upper lake, primarily we're going to see today. We'll be going out around the island, the other islands up, hopefully on the Spring Park Bay, so we see the other side of the island, and then swing back on the other side and back here to Ellen Elma's. Anybody has input? You know, I'm always learning, like to know more about this area, especially about the island. It's a very unique place. Certainly has its own history by itself, and I think a book eventually probably be written about it by itself. But how many are living on the island right now? How many? So the rest of us, all the ones that used to live on the island, is that the rest of us? Okay. Who knows the official name of the island?
Phelps.
Phelps, right. And how did the name Phelps show up? Anybody know that?
Carrington Phelps bought it.
Carrington Phelps, you got it right.
William Noble owned it.
That's right. Going back to the early 1850s, when the lake area was first opened to settlement by the treaties that they did with the Dakota Indians. The first people that came out here, one of the first, we'll talk about some more of this too at the Gillespie Center, but Orson Noble, and we think it's his brother William Noble, each took a claim. William was on the east side of the island, I believe, and Orson was on the, no, it's the other way around. Orson's on the east side, William on the west side. And down at the far end of the island was actually property that was granted to the St. Paul and Sioux City Railroad through a land grant. And so those were the original three owners of Island Park. And they were out there for several years, over 20 years. But as you know, the island, it's probably not the easiest place in the world to do some farming. So along about 1875, Carrington Phelps, who was a St. Paul lawyer, graduate of Yale. We believe he was about 28 years old at the time, fairly young man. Came out and bought the entire island from the Noble estates, or from the estates of the Noble brothers. And up until that time, of course, it was called Noble's Island. Well, with Phelps, he built a lodge that we'll pass closely by where his place used to be and point that out a little bit later on. And he lived out in the island, or used it as a summer retreat and hunting preserve for close to 30 years before he decided to sell it for development after the tornado of 1904. So anyway, we'll be talking a lot more about the island today. As we cruise a little bit further away, I'll point out some of the other important sites in the upper lake area, which we'll be passing by here. To the north here, to your right, looking towards the front of the boat, we have the north shore of Cook's Bay. And of course, this area is very important in the history of Mound, Westonka. It was in 1854 that Matthias Cook staked his claim over here pretty close to where the water tower is, and set up his home. He was one of the first pioneers in the Westonka area. And it wasn't long before Cook decided to start inviting guests out to his home, and he decided to build the first hotel up here in the upper lake. And it was called Cook's Lakeview House. And that thrived pretty well, went on for a number of years, and some other people followed him in the hotel business as we go further down the shoreline. Just before the Lost Lake Channel, it's kind of hard to see. You can see the bridge where the cars are passing over there. Just on this side of the bridge was the Dewey House, which was one of the later hotels, but also survived quite a bit longer than any hotel, being burned down as a fire practice back in 1985. Right across the Lost Lake Channel was the Bartlett Hotel. That was a very famous hotel up here that was built by Edward Bartlett. And there was a number of Indian mounds on the property. Today there's still an Indian mound on that property. The people that own it now have preserved that. And when you're driving down Bartlett Boulevard, you can actually see the old concrete stairway that went up to the Bartlett Hotel. It's still there. Okay, moving further west down Bartlett Boulevard along Cooks Bay here, about halfway between Bartlett's and the Chapman condominiums was the summer home of Governor Horace Austin. He was one of the early governors of Minnesota back in the 1870s, and he did a lot of entertaining out here, state officials and national officials that came out to visit him on Lake Minnetonka. And then, of course, close to where the condominiums are there now was the site of the famous Chapman House, which was built in 1875, I believe, by the Chapman brothers. And that also is one of the most important hotels in the Upper Lake. They had built a casino building for dancing and later bowling. That building, of course, became the Surfside that remained on the Cooks Bay shore for many, many years. Further down the lake shore, we've got the Highlands. That was the site of the Buena Vista Hotel, run by the famous Captain Jack Hart, who was one of the most famous fishermen out here on the lake for a number of years, and he was always prided himself on getting people out to get the biggest fish, and that was back around 1905, 1920 or so. Looking up towards the next bay is Priest Bay. Well, we'll pick up where we left off here. We're heading south. The long skinny point coming out here, of course, is Hardscrabble. That was named apparently after a farmer who was having a lot of difficulty trying to make a living on the land in there. The high bluff over here. I've heard a number of people call it Indian Hill or Indian Bluff.
That's Indian Hill over there?
I've heard that called Indian Hill. Up on the top, there are 7 Indian mounds still.
7 Indian mounds.
7 Indian mounds up on top of the hill over here, still extant. Luckily, a lot of the property has been preserved by the Nature Conservancy, so hopefully that will remain natural. Before the big house was built by, I'm not sure who's there now, it used to be Shaughnessy. That was the home of Morris Baker. Morris Baker, who Morris Baker Park is named after it, the Maple Plain.
Now that's
over here, now we got, well, he just sold it too, so I don't know who's in there now. But if you see the,
Somebody told me.
the older remodeled cabin was actually on the Baker estate, and his daughter lived there. In that home down there. All right, the thin stretch of land here between the Upper Lake and Halstead's Bay is called the Pass. It was the home for many years of Dick Gray, who wrote a column in the local papers and was a founder of the Freshwater Institute. Before there were homes here, this was a very popular spot to go swimming and have picnics. The home with the columns is the former home of Terry Redland, the painter. I believe his daughter still lives there.
Which one's there? What is that? Right in here?
The one with the columns.
The little one.
A tornado came out from the southwest that headed over to the island.
Yep. I know where it hit.
Yeah. We're the first spot. The first touchdown right here.
Right, yeah. They recovered better.
What's that?
They appear to have recovered a lot better.
Oh, yeah. This was stripped. You'll have to look at
Trees, and it was all the leaves were just coming out. It was all green. All the little leaves were gone. All the little twigs were gone. Only the major limbs. In the top of the one tree is a wash machine.
Hermitage. And It'll be coming up here quickly. I just want to give you a little background information on the Hermitage.
Okay.
And it's kind of important because, as a lot of you know, they're just about ready to start developing that property. And that is pretty important for the story that goes behind this place. 1855, Frank Halstead was one of the first people to claim the land over on Halstead's Bay. He had a place there for a short time called Rough and Ready. He went to the Civil War, got up pretty far in rank, and then came back to Minnesota when the war was over, 1865, and he set up his home over here on the upper lake. And very unusual gentleman. He liked the solitary living over here, since there was basically nobody else along this stretch in those days. And he became very prominent in the community. Closest real community, of course, in those days was Excelsior. He was the Justice of Peace for Minnetrista, the first one, and very active in the church in Excelsior. Up about 1876, he was preparing to launch a steamboat that he invested in called the Mary, and the day before it was to launch, he mysteriously his body mysteriously showed up weighted down by stones out here halfway between his home and Crane Island. Most people suspected it was a suicide. There was rumors that he was having troubles with finances. There was also talk about a love interest that had scorned him. But anyway, that was the end of Frank. And then his brother George came out from New Jersey, where the family was from, and to settle up on the estate. And George liked the place so much, and he was a single guy also, kind of an oddball, kind of an eccentric. He decided he'd become the second hermit of Lake Minnetonka. And he was actually the more famous hermit of the two, because he was really kind of a screwball. He collected all kinds of weird stuff. He filled his home up with all kinds of stuff. This is where the home was, right straight across here with the white Rambler.
Any relation to Jim?
This is it right here, right there. Yep.
Would that be in relation to Terry Herman?
And so
He planted suicide.
Terry did?
Yeah, like in the early 60s.
Yeah.
So Frank enjoyed living as the hermit life there for another 21 years or so, and in 1901 he died in a fire in the home. They thought he might have been smoking in bed. They weren't sure exactly what caused it. But that was the end of the second hermit. And actually, both brothers are still buried in front of that house. And there's some, you've been reading in the local newspapers, they're trying to figure out what to do with the guys when they start developing this all into homes.
Oh, okay.
Actually, the developers already invested in 2 burial plots to move the brothers into a cemetery. So that's the Hermitage.
I think that...
Next historic site, this is the site of the famous Wood End Dairy Farm. This was one of those large hobby farms that very well-to-do gentlemen, businessmen from Minneapolis, St. Paul, would book farm-type estates out on Lake Minnetonka, especially up in the upper lake where it was less developed. He started his Wood End Farm in 1904 and brought in some of the top performing Guernsey cows from all over the world. So this was basically a big dairy farm. They used to be all open there with cows grazing. You can see the original home of Mr. A.C. Loring. He was the son of Charles Loring, who Loring Park is named after down in Minneapolis. That's where the Loring name comes from around over here. And he was an executive with Northwestern Milling, and I think later with Pillsbury. The point to our south here on my right is called Howard's Point. It's named for a settler named Silas Howard. His home was built pretty much right out here at the end of the point. He later sold that to a banker named Merrill, who also had his home on Howard's Point. He later donated or sold his land off for a camp for girls, and he named it after his mother, Jeanette. So this was called the Jeanette Merrill Park, or Jeanette Merrill Camp. And for many years, girls from Minneapolis, St. Paul would come out and spend the summer at the camp that used to be on Howard's Point. to the north of the bridge down this way. That was the first home that we know of that's documented on the island. Carrington Phelps, the gentleman who the island's named after. A Minneapolis businessman named Horace Gates built a summer lodge just south of where Tippewalkin used to be. And he wanted to have better, easier access for the boats coming to his estate, so he actually cut the point off there so that boats could get into his place. Just north of, I mentioned Tippewalkin, that originally was the site of Woolno's Maple Heights Inn. It was another lake area hotel that was built by the predecessor of the Great Northern Railroad in 1887. The proprietor was J.L. Woolno, who was a famous train conductor that worked the train between Wayzata and Mound. He's actually credited with coming up with the current pronunciation of Wayzata. Up until then, it was more like Wayzate. But because of the way he'd always announced the train coming into Wayzata, people kind of picked up on it, and it's been called that ever since. That's a story I've heard anyway. Actually, the hotel, Maple Heights Inn, was managed by his wife, Mrs. Woolno. And then later, years later, after it was no longer a hotel, it became a church camp, the Christian Club, and then Tippewalkin was its last. As we swing back into the docks for Alan Alma's here, just to let everybody know that later this afternoon at the Gillespie Center, I'll be doing a part of a presentation on the very early history of the island itself. I want to thank everybody for putting up with no microphone. It's been difficult to hear, and if you have any questions, I can try to answer them afterward or up at the Gillespie. Otherwise, I'd like to thank everybody that has listened to us today here, and look forward to the rest of the program.
Welcome to the Island Park celebration. You guys are amazing. Raise your hand if you went on the Island Park tour on the boat.
Hey, we went on.
How was it on the boat? Super. My name is Pam Myers, and I'm with the Westonka Historical Society. I'm a new kid here. I didn't come till '81. I retired from the school district. I was the assistant principal at the middle school. If you have a problem with being quiet and sitting down in the lunchroom, we'll talk about it. How did I learn my way around the island? Middle school kid said, "I can't stay for detention. I don't have a ride home." And I said, "No problem, I'll take you." And then I was lost for the evening on the island. But I learned to love the island as you did. And many of you come from far away, and we'll talk a little about that as the evening progresses. We have a proclamation to read, and I haven't seen David. David Osmick is here from Mound City Council. He has a proclamation from the Mound City Council in your honor. David. Do you need a copy?
No, I have it with me. Good afternoon. What a great crowd. I'm amazed on how many people have come from far and wide to come to this event today. And
You might need to stand right up to that mic. Thank you.
what a fantastic crowd. It really is great to see everyone here today. I'm here acting on behalf of the mayor, who is unavoidably detained today. He has another commitment, but he sent a letter, and I'll read it to you along with the proclamation. Greetings to one and all. I offer my best wishes to everyone on this special day. I deeply regret that I cannot attend the festivities today as I have a prior commitment outside of Mound. Being an Island Park resident myself for the last 20 years, I truly wish I could have been there. That is why I am sending Acting Mayor Osmick to represent the city in my absence. For those of you who are currently live in Mound, thank you for your interest in our community and its history. For those of you who came back to Mound for this event, whether from across town or from across the country, I offer you a hearty welcome back. I hope you find reliving the memories of a joyous experience and help to rekindle your fondness for the city of Mound. My wish is for all who gather here today to thoroughly enjoy Island Park Day in Mound as it has been officially proclaimed. With my deepest respect, Mark Honest, Mayor of Mound. And I will read the proclamation. This proclamation was actually read at our last council meeting. It is City of Mound Resolution 0747, resolution proclaiming Island Park Day in the City of Mound. Whereas Island Park in the City of Mound has a rich and colorful history, and whereas the Island Park area was both home and social center for the people who lived there, and whereas on June 23, 2007, the Westonka Historical Society is holding an Island Park celebration in and around the Island Park area, and whereas former residents are arriving from all locales, both locally and around the United States, to participate in this event, and whereas the volunteer committee is being sponsored by the Westonka Historical Society with the planning committee chaired by Doug and Donna Easthouse, and whereas the event is to celebrate the history and relive the countless memories that Island Park has provided, now therefore be it resolved that the City Council of the City of Mound proclaim June 23rd as Island Park Day in the City of Mound, Minnesota, adopted by the City Council on the 12th day of June 2007. Thank you. Thank you for coming back, and thank you very much.
We have 15 speakers scheduled for your enjoyment as the afternoon goes along. They have been giving a specific amount of time, and you might already realize there'll be a bell that will ring when they need to be done. We're starting with Jeff Magnuson. He's a member of our local historical society and our local historian, and he's going to start with early days on the island. Jeff. Please welcome Jeff.
Thank you, Pam. Hopefully everybody that was out on my boat tour earlier can hear it a little better than we did out there. It was kind of hard to hear with the wind and everything else going on. But anyway, again, I'm Jeff Magnuson, one of the members of the board of the Lake Westonka Historical Society. Also spent 11 years out on the island, so I've got the button. I live there. Anyway, my deal today, I'm just going to talk about the real early history of Island Park. And our story is going to go way back about 10,000 years ago, when the last glaciers were receding from the Lake Minnetonka area. From melt deposits of gravel, rock, and soil, Island Park received more than its fair share of steep hills, marshes, and hollows. It was also given a beautiful shoreline with many different peninsulas, high banks, and wonderful sand beaches. A county survey made near the end of the 19th century described Phelps Island as follows. Phelps Island, the largest in Lake Minnetonka, contains 545.9 acres with 5 3/4 miles of shoreline. 4 1/4 miles of this consists of hard gravelly beach or rocky shore, and 1 1/2 miles of meadowland. The land is rolling, covered largely by fine growth of maple, elm, ash, oak, and linden, and the soil is a rich black loam. The value of the timber alone is conservatively estimated at least $20,000. The first evidence of human habitation on the island was the presence of the man-made mounds, similar to hundreds of others that once surrounded the bays of Lake Minnetonka. Mounds were constructed of either for burial or for ceremonial purposes. The mounds varied greatly in size and shape. Most of the surviving mounds, or the few that survive, are round or domed shape. But there were also many elongated mounds and ones that were formed in the shape of animals and other things. According to archaeologists, the mounds date to the late woodland period, which was approximately about 500 to 1,000 years ago. The mounds in the lake area were typically situated on a high bluff, such as the ones that still survive on Halstead's Bay and over by Zumbra Heights. Based on the 1883 survey published in Winchell's Aborigines of Minnesota, a group of 11 mounds were surveyed on Phelps Island along the high southeast facing bank, which would today be parallel to Island View Drive. At the time of the survey, portions of these mounds had already been eroded away somewhat. And of course, with the development of roads, cottages, and homes, it's really pretty hard to find any remnant of those mounds in that area. Two other smaller mound groups were located further inland on the island, and those also have disappeared. Though surveys do not mention it, there are many of us who've lived on the island have believed that there was a mound on the lake shore near Pelican Point, which would be on what we used to call the Turnquist property. The island remained the domain of the Dakota people until settlement was opened by treaty to settlers in the early 1850s. However, though it is not well documented, it would seem that very likely that there were probably trappers and other people of European descent living in the Lake Minnetonka area prior to this. There was a trappers trading post just above the Minnesota River in Chaska, and the recent discovery of a flintlock trapper's pistol dated to around 1800 at the site of the new parking garage that's being built in Mound would certainly make this sound plausible. In 1855, A.S. Diamond, who later would publish the Lake Minnetonka Tourist newspaper and promote Lake Minnetonka far and wide, met a guy named Orson Noble, a St. Paul grocer, and the two decided to make a claim together on the biggest island in Lake Minnetonka. Mr. Diamond intended to stay the winter on the claim to prove it up, but he had to make one last trip back to St. Paul to get some additional supplies. When he came back to the island a few days later, everything that they'd had there set up before was stolen, and Diamond pretty much decided to give up on the claim. William Noble, a relative of Orson, made his claim on the western half of the island in 1856, and Orson Noble's claim became official on the eastern half 5 years later. The southwestern part of the island was initially railroad property set aside by the government for a land grant to the Sioux City Railroad. For the next several years, the island would be called Noble's Island. Due to its isolation, rolling terrain, and dense hardwood forest, the island was probably a pretty difficult place to farm. In 1875, Carrington Phelps, a 28-year-old St. Paul lawyer, purchased the entire island from the Nobles. He built his summer home, or lodge, on the high ground at the far southern tip of the island in 1877. There were no roads to the island at this time, and he had all the building supplies shipped over from Excelsior by boat. Phelps set up a large garden, and they had a cow to keep for fresh milk. Visitors to Phelps Lodge would find the family taking tea under the grand old trees, enjoying the summer breeze off the upper lake. Mr. Phelps, an avid sportsman and outdoorsman, and his family enjoyed the wild solitude and natural wonders of the island for the next several years. The island was now known as Phelps Island, its official name to this day. The bay just south of the island also became known as Phelps Bay. Mr. Phelps' original intent was to keep the island a private park with no subdivisions. He would lease spots for tents or knock down cottages to the right parties. However, in the late 1880s, Mr. Phelps began to allow limited development on his island property.
The first was the Maple Heights Inn, sponsored by the Great Northern Railroad, built in 1887 on the high northeast bank of the island with a commanding view of Spring Park Bay. Well-known train conductor J.H. Woolnough was the proprietor, but the hotel was actually managed by his wife, Mrs. Woolnough. A road was cut from Spring Park, where the railroad terminated at that time, to give access to the hotel. Visitors were encouraged to walk a half-mile south from the depot or catch a ride on a horse-drawn bus for 5 cents. According to a 1906 tourist brochure, you could stay at the Maple Heights Inn for $1.50 per day or $7 to $10 per week. This was a bargain compared to the nearby Del Otero Hotel that charged $2 per day. This made Woolnough's popular with the more budget-minded tourists. In 1896, 65 lots designated Phelps Island Park were surveyed along the lakeshore just south of Woolnough's hotel. At the same time, Phelps dedicated a 20-foot roadway along the lakeshore from Black Lake Bridge to Pembroke and along the south shore of Black Lake to the marsh. This road was to be for the exclusive use of abutting lakeshore owners. Eventually, of course, this street was vacated and deeded to each property owner. A 1901 issue of Excelsior's Minnetonka Record advertised that Phelps Island Park was the choicest locality on the upper lake, with lots on the eastern shore of the island offered at $200 to $500 each. Just south of Woolnough's, Minneapolis businessman Horace Gates built a large summer home where the Pelican Point neighborhood is today. It was in a small log cabin on this property in 1902 that novelist Everson Hugh wrote a famous book of the time called The Mississippi Bubble. Mr. Gates cut the channel through Pelican Point to allow easy access to his estate. The property was later owned by the Turnquist family. Other lots on the east side were purchased by the Lewis, Squires, and Beach families, who each built substantial summer homes. In August 1904, a tornado loomed out of the southwest from toward the direction of Wood End Farm and cut a path across the island, somewhat similar to the one 61 years later. With the idyllic woodland park partially devastated, Phelps decided it might be a good time to sell his island to a development company. The island was platted in 1908 as North Shore Park, and the lots were offered for sale by the Tuxedo Realty Company. A maze of streets and hundreds of 50-foot wide lots were surveyed. Street locations did not always take into account the rolling, marshy topography of the island. A separate division to administer the development of the island, named the Tuxedo Park Company, was also formed. Avalon and Brighton were platted first in 1908, followed by Devon in 1911, and Douglas and Whipple in 1913. Similar to Carrington Phelps a dozen years earlier, the Tuxedo Company dedicated a 20-foot roadway along the lake shore as commons from Pembroke to Cumberland. At this time, the western half of the island was in Minnetrista Township, and the eastern half was in Excelsior Township. The lots were aggressively marketed. Very little money was required for the down payment. In fact, the purchase of a round-trip ticket to Spring Park was considered a down payment on a lot. Payment plans for lots were as low as 50 cents per week. Sales agents were stationed outside the city's high schools to sell lots to male students as they headed for home at the end of the school day. One student at Central High School, named James Coles, purchased one 50 by 50 foot lot for $100, setting up a payment of $2 per month. He later talked his father into buying an adjacent lot so they would have enough room to build something. There were some real bargains at this time. The 1913 plat map shows a block of 4 lots on Manchester Road purchased for $100 and another block of 6 for $150. Based on the consumer price index, $100 in 1913 is only $2,200 today, so these were tremendous bargains. Several Minneapolis organizations purchased lots and built clubhouses also. Neighborhoods, taking their names from the English place names which were attributed to Carrington Phelps, started their own improvement associations. These included Chester, Whipple, Pembroke, Arden, Avalon, Witchwood, and Douglas. Brush was cleared and cinder-surfaced roads were built. Streetlights were strung up. The Tuxedo Company financed a boat for Leonard Cap Shadeen to ferry people from the train depot to various docks on the island. In 1909, the Twin City Rapid Transit Company's fleet of yellow streetcar boats began making regular stops at Woolnose and Pembroke docks. John Iverson, one of the first year-round residents, had a nice business and also ran a livery service to bring prospective lot buyers out to the island. At first, groceries were ordered from Pearson's or others in Mound and delivered by horse and wagon. Later, small grocery stores were set up all over the island. The first post office on the island was at Woolnose Hotel. Recently, while doing an inventory of items stored at the Westonka Historical Society, we came across an audio tape recorded by Gladys Frederickson in 1978, recounting the very early days on the island. In 1910, her family purchased 2 lots in the Witchwood section, not far from the bridge at Cook's Bay. They didn't buy on the lakeshore because Gladys's grandmother, who was living with the family at the time, was from New Brunswick, Canada, and she didn't want to be living any place exposed to cold and wind. The family rented a Tuxedo Company house. The house had 4 good-sized rooms, a porch across the front, a small space behind for the kitchen. There was a half-story upstairs where the children slept, unless it was too hot. Rainwater was used for washing, and drinking water was obtained from a pump at Avalon Park. Laundry was either done in the lake or taken back to the city. The ice box consisted of a wash tub filled with ice delivered by John Iverson and covered with gunny sacks. An outhouse stood out back that was frequented by a family of skunks. A hike over to Woolnose to get the mail always meant getting a little dressed up because it was kind of a ritzy place to the young Gladys. Drawbridges had been installed at Witchwood and Black Lake to access the island. In 1915, a new bridge was built connecting Island Park with Enchanted Island. First called the White Bridge, later the Red Bridge, it replaced another earlier small drawbridge. Phelps Island had now become a thriving summer colony. Telephone service was extended to the island, and another post office added at the Phelps Island Grocery. There were now 6 grocery stores to serve the 200 core residents, as well as the many, many more summer visitors and summer cottage residents. In 1916, the island had its own newspaper published, called the Summer Breeze. The editor was James Coles, the same gentleman mentioned earlier, who was only 21 at that time and a veteran landowner on the island. He and his staff, a group of buddies, filled the paper with all the local doings and included a good dose of humor. The staff would come to the call of the Tuxedo Company to perform various jobs such as clearing brush and weeds so that prospective lot buyers could reach a certain spot for inspection the following Sunday. The 4th and last issue of the Summer Breeze included a hopeful promise that the paper would be published again for the next season, but this was not to be. America entered World War I in April 1917, and Coles and the rest of his staff went off to Europe to fight in the war. America and the island were entering a new era that would bring many changes and challenges. That pretty much concludes the story up to about 1920, and with that I will turn it back over to Pam. Thank you very much.
Our next person who's going to share with you a little about her family history is Betty Ellers. Betty Iverson Ellers.
This has to come off the top of my head.
That's fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Let's see, I love the island. I was born there in 1930, November. I'm sure they were happy. And then Donnie, my cousin Donnie Bull, was born the next week, so the family started growing. And I don't know, everything that I think about, I'm so happy to be here. I really am, because Donnie called me and said, "Are you going to go?" And I said, I don't think I can, because my husband had a couple of serious operations. And then my husband overheard me say, I wish I could go. And he said, go. And I said, okay. Yeah, okay. So all I remember is I was born there. I lived there. I lived at my grandma's house for a year when I went to kindergarten, and I loved it. And my Uncle Lenny there and Uncle Harold were still at home, and my Aunt Esther was still at home, and she shared a room with me. And I shared a room with her. And Uncle Harold and Uncle Lenny would say, there goes Betty Lou. She is so tall, she sleeps in the kitchen with her feet in the hall. And I was 5, and I thought, gee, I'm going to be 18 foot tall, you know. And let's see, what else? Oh, Grandpa had, he took me out on the porch, and he said, see those buttons up there? And I said, yeah. And he said, don't ever touch them. And I said, okay. And it was a siren. And so if anybody called in with a fire, then it was to my grandpa's house and my grandma. And then, you know, they rang the siren. And the first guy there of the volunteer fire department was the guy that drove the truck. You know, so that was interesting. Let's see, what else? Anyway, I loved being there at Grandma's house. And then our friends, Billy Simers, Billy, the Cuban kids, my cousin, the Bull kids, we were all really good friends. We could run, it was so different, you know, from what we know now. But we could run all over the island and not worry about anybody hurting us or getting into trouble or anything like that. Let's see, what else do we do? Well, not much, not much. And those kids could go swimming anytime they wanted to, but my mom said, don't go in the lake without an adult, so I never did. But Donnie and Bobby and those guys could. You did. And let's see, Donnie and I were in school together every grade, and it was like having another brother. And my brother's here from Oregon. Donnie's here from Washington. I'm here from Las Vegas. This is my sweet baby. And let's see, what else do you want to know? What do they want to know? We just had a really, it was so good.
I want to tell a little story. Stay here.
I will. There's the mic.
Just
Speak right up to the mic. Put your face right up there.
like all of us, way back, I believed in the Easter Bunny, Santa Claus, and on Christmas Eve at Grandma's house.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes. And we were a big extended family there. Santa Claus would come knocking on the window, around the house, knocking on the window. Pretty soon, come in with his big bag. He did have fireman's boots on.
Yeah.
And red suit that I remember, later I remembered vividly, was stored down at the fire station across the street. And then if we sang Jingle Bells or a little bit of it at least,
Anything, yeah.
then our gift would be pulled out of the bag.
Yep.
This was an annual event and pretty dear to everybody.
And I continued this throughout my whole family. I have 4 kids, 15 grandkids, and 10 great-grandkids, and continued it. And I bet you I made 1 million Swedish meatballs for Christmas Eve in my lifetime. Always, huh?
Dan.
Lutefisk and lefse.
Dan. Anyway, my son. Dan, no. After, of course, Santa Claus would leave, and we're all so excited, and she said to me, that isn't really Santa Claus. That's Uncle Lenny. I hated the message.
I'm so sorry.
I still love the messenger, but I hated the message. She broke my belief.
Oh. You're a sweetheart, you are. We thank you, you know. What a family.